But imagine it's 1963, and Detroit is on top of the world. The city's leaders are among the most visionary in America, grandson of the first Ford, Henry Ford II, influential labor leader Walter Reuther, Motown's founder Berry Gordy, the Reverend C.L. Franklin and his daughter, the amazing Aretha, Governor George Romney, Mormon and civil rights advocate, supercar salesman Lee Iacocca as well, Mayor Jerome Kavanaugh, a Kennedy acolyte, Police Commissioner George Edwards, Martin Luther King. It was the American automaker's best year ever. The revolution in the music and politics were as well underway, and Reuther's UAW had helped lift the middle class upward. David Maraniss has written about these people in his book and will speak about them and that city in Once in a Great City, a Detroit Story. As I think we know by now, but bears repeating, David is an associate editor of the Washington Post. And in addition to Once in a Great City, a Detroit Story, he is the author as well of 6 critically acclaimed and best-selling books: Barack Obama, The Story; When Pride Still Mattered, A Life of Vince Lombardi; First in His Class, a biography of Bill Clinton; They Marched into Sunlight, War and Peace, Vietnam and America, October 1967; Clemente, The Passion and Grace of Baseball's Last Hero; and Rome, 1960, the Summer Olympics that stirred the world. He's also an author of Intro to the Story, A Writer's Journey Through Life, Politics, Sports, and Loss, The Clinton Enigma, and co-author of The Prince of Tennessee, Al Gore Meets His Fate, as well as Tell Newt to Shut Up. He is a 3-time Pulitzer Prize finalist and won the Pulitzer Prize for national reporting in 1993 for his newspaper coverage of then presidential candidate Bill Clinton. He was also part of the Washington Post team that won a 2008 Pulitzer for the newspaper's coverage of the Virginia Tech shooting. He has won several other notable awards for achievements in journalism, including the George Polk Award, the Dirksen Prize for congressional reporting, and the ASNE Leventhal Prize for deadline writing. So, ladies and gentlemen, David Maraniss.
Thank you, Ellsworth. It's great to be home. I'm in the middle of a 2-month book tour, and Madison is home, even though Linda and I are here about 3 months and 9 months in D.C. This is where we feel our home is. It's nice to be home, even though yesterday I was in Los Angeles and it was 84 degrees. Couldn't believe when I landed at O'Hare, and I felt like I was back in winter. For all of my books, I need to have an obsession to begin. Some way that it connects deeply with my sociological interests, my personal interests, with my soul in some fashion. And this book came to me in probably the most unusual way, which has a connection to another book. I was in New York City in February of 2011 in a bar across the street from the Circle in the Square Theater with the cast of Lombardi, the play that was inspired by my book on the Green Bay Packer coach. And it was kind of surreal. I was standing there next to Dan Lauria, who was playing Vince Lombardi on Broadway. And at halftime of the game, the network showed a little skit where Dan Lauria was playing Lombardi on the screen. I was a little too nervous to pay much attention because I wasn't sure the Packers were going to win yet. But after that skit, I looked up again and I saw a commercial with a freeway sign that said Detroit. And I started to pay attention. And then I saw all of these wonderful iconic images of that city, of the Joe Louis Fist downtown, representing the Brown Bomber, the great boxer who came out of Detroit. The marvelous Diego Rivera mural of Detroit Industries in the Detroit Institute of Arts. This black sedan driving up Woodward Avenue, the main thoroughfare of Detroit. And then inside the car was Eminem, Marshall Mathers. I'm too old to be an Eminem guy, but there was this hypnotic backbeat to the commercial. And then he drives up to the glorious Fox Theater, and gets out and walks into the darkened theater, and there's a black gospel choir on stage rising in song. And then Eminem turns to the camera and says, "This is the Motor City. This is what we do." I choked up watching that. There was tears in my eyes. And my wife, who isn't here today, so I can tell this story, she doesn't like it that much, basically said to me, "David, you moron, why are you falling for this? You know, it's a Chrysler commercial. They're just trying to sell cars. And Detroit's a mess." And of course she was right. But there was something deeper there. Our daughter, Sarah, who is very supportive of the whole family, and she's a writer too, she said, "Dad, you're behind the times. You got to get some videos going on your presentations." In that regard, I am a moron. I'm terrible at technology, but I did bring some videos. And this first one we're going to show, just to get you into the scene, it begins with, this takes place in 1963, most of the book, and I'll explain that in a minute. But it starts with this very sort of archaic little presentation by the then mayor of Detroit, Jerome Kavanaugh, and then switches to what got me going. So if we can. Okay, that about makes sense. The error didn't occur when we were practicing it, but we'll just try one more time and then we'll forget it. I don't know why that would have happened. Okay, well that was the commercial, but we don't have that much time anyway, so I can easily go without this.
I'm sorry.
So they got me thinking, what can I do why did it hit me that way? Well, I was born in Detroit. I'm more associated with Madison, where my family moved when I was 8 years old, and with Washington, D.C., where we've lived for most of the last 40 years. But Detroit was where it all started. And so my earliest primordial memories are Detroit, the Boblo boat, Verner's ginger ale, so strong it would go up your nostrils. Hudson's department store, where my mom worked over Christmas. A couple of traumatic memories. We lived on a flat on Dexter, and my mother, when I was 6, would put me on a bus down to the Fisher Y, where I'd get out and have to go into this freezing swimming pool naked with other boys learning how to swim. And another memory of sitting on the flat. We lived on the second story, and we'd be up on the flat, and my older brother and sister would quiz me on the new 1955 model cars as they drove down the street, because this was Detroit. So all of that got me thinking about what I could do. I'm a writer. I wanted to write. And I wanted not just to write about what Detroit meant to me, but what it meant to America. And that's really what this book is. Because Detroit gave an enormous amount to this country, not just automobiles and the soundtrack of my generation, Motown, but also the labor movement. Essentially, the heart of the labor movement was in Detroit with the United Auto Workers. And connected to that was civil rights. In the 1960s, when the civil rights movement was at its zenith, Detroit was incredibly important in supporting that, and as was the labor movement. So that got me thinking about how to write about it. Other writers can write about the financial downfall of Detroit, the bankruptcy. I'm not a financial writer. I'm more interested in sociology and character and sort of why things happen the way they do. So I started thinking about those elements and how I can put them together into a nonfiction narrative story. And it took me to a very specific period. My sort of, the way I operate as a journalist and as an author, I use the metaphor, I set up an oil rig somewhere and dig down as deeply as I can, rather than going wide and shallow. So I found a period of time where I could tell the story of Detroit, with the shadows of its collapse there as well. The book starts in October of 1962, when on the same week, actually 2 days, the Detroit Auto Show opened downtown at Cobo Hall, introducing the 1963 cars that sold more than any before. They were very big cars. And in secret in Dearborn and at the J. Walter at Ford Motor Company in Dearborn and at the J. Walter Thompson's huge Detroit offices downtown in the Buell Building, a new car was being conceived that became sort of the symbol of that era, the Mustang. That same day, on West Grand Boulevard, a busload of artists, singers, left for its first review of the country, the Motortown Review, with this incredible collection of talent. Little Stevie Wonder at age 13, Marvin Gaye, Mary Wells, Martha and the Vandellas, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, the Marvelettes, and a group called the Supremes who hadn't made it yet, and everybody was nervous about whether they would. They were the opening act. That began at the same time. The center of the tension of the book is between creation and creativity and decay and destruction. It's going on in all of us at the same time, and in Detroit in that period, it was very intense. The creativity of creating the Mustang and of this marvelous music, the decay that was coming. At this very moment, in the early summer of 1963, some sociologists at Wayne State University issued a report that said that Detroit was losing its population by 500,000 by the end of that decade, and that depopulation would continue at that rate of 500,000 every decade from then on, diminishing its tax base and really hollowing out the city. This is before the 1967 riots in Detroit. It's before the pension difficulties that came later. It's before the corrupt mayors, all of which you can argue to one degree or another didn't help Detroit, certainly, but the structural problems were there already. Even as Detroit was glowing, I describe it as an incandescent star that was actually a dying star. It was happening then. The creative side of Motown had a particular draw to me because I loved their music. But I wanted to figure out, why did it happen there? Why do certain cities, why do certain civilizations have these bursts, these creative bursts? And some of the reasons for that in Detroit in the early 1960s were obvious. One was the entrepreneurial genius of a family, the Berry Gordy and his sisters and his parents. It wasn't just, Berry Gordy is sort of the founder of Motown, but it was really a family enterprise. His family had a little fund that they voted to distribute money to any member who had a good cause, and Berry said, I want to start this music company. His family voted to give him $800, and that's how Motown began in 1959. He had a particular knack at finding wonderful artists. It was pure luck, perhaps, that in one sense, that so many of these great singers happened to live in Detroit. Smokey Robinson, as a little boy, would go over to a preacher's house, Reverend Franklin, the father of Aretha, and they would sing together when they were like 5 and 6 years old. So that's part of it. Part of it is because of the great migration of African Americans from Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and Louisiana up to the industrial cities of the North, especially Chicago and Detroit, bringing with them this oral tradition of song and blues and jazz. But there were two other reasons that I discovered as I was doing the reporting. One had to do with geography and economics. Detroit is this vast geographic place, 28 miles across. It's mostly single-family homes. And in those homes, and there was people who lived in them were working middle class with some disposable income. And they all had pianos in their houses. And Detroit had this fabulous, the largest piano manufacturer in the country then, Grinnell Brothers, which both made pianos and sold them in a way that they were affordable for those working class families, so that every musician that I interviewed talked about the piano in their house. And the other factor that fascinated me was public school music teachers. The Motown artists could remember their elementary school music teacher, their junior high music teacher, their senior high teacher. I interviewed Martha Reeves, and she talked to me about Emily Wagstaff, who taught her in elementary school. And then sort of a thrilling moment, I've interviewed Bill Clinton and Barack Obama and Muhammad Ali and many world figures. I have them all on tapes, which I might give to Ellsworth someday. That's the plan. But one of my favorite tapes is of an interview I did with Martha Reeves. We were sitting, she came over to the Motown Museum, and we were sitting there, and she was describing these music teachers, and then she talked about her senior high teacher, Harry Begian, and how he was a disciplinarian who taught them the fundamentals and the classics. And she was plucked out of her choir at age 16 to sing an opera aria downtown at the Ford Auditorium. And she's describing that, and she's getting more and more into it, and then all of a sudden she breaks into the aria. 71-year-old Martha Reeves on tape singing this aria, which is quite beautiful. So those are some of the reasons that Detroit had that incredible burst of creative energy in the early 1960s. The civil rights aspect of it is really what sort of I consider the center pole of my book, how I figured out where it would begin and end sort of based on that center pole. And it was June 23rd, 1963. This was the summer of civil rights. Birmingham had happened a couple months earlier, where Martin Luther King and his supporters were hosed and attacked by police dogs and jailed. The United Auto Workers, led by Walter Reuther, who was not only progressive in terms of bringing up the working class into the middle class of his auto workers, but also incredibly progressive on civil rights. His United Auto Workers bailed most of those demonstrators out of jail in Birmingham. They were essentially the bank of the civil rights movement in that period. Reverend Franklin, who I just mentioned, Aretha's dad, was this flamboyant, colorful, controversial preacher, the most popular preacher in Detroit. His New Bethel Baptist Church would attract thousands of parishioners from the streets mostly. The traditional Black Ministerial Alliance, Baptist Ministerial Alliance, looked down upon Franklin. They thought he was too flamboyant, not reserved enough. But he was a friend of Mahalia Jackson's and of Martin Luther King's. And Mahalia Jackson, the singer, called him and said, "You should help the civil rights movement and hold a rally in the North, in Detroit," which he decided to do. There was a lot of controversy about it. Some of the established black leaders in the city didn't think he could pull it off. But it went forward, and on June 23rd, King arrived in Detroit. He was greeted at the airport by the police commissioner, George Edwards, a progressive who had stepped down from the Michigan Supreme Court to take the job with the sole intent of trying to improve race relations in a city that had much difficulty over decades, going back to a horrible riot during World War II, a fight over jobs and housing, sparked by whites who'd come up from Appalachia against the African Americans who were working there. And then more recently, controversy over police actions in the African American community. So Edwards took the job for that purpose. He greeted King at the airport by saying, "You'll find no police dogs here." The city was ready to embrace Martin Luther King. So much so that 150,000 people gathered on Woodward Avenue and walked down to Cobo Arena that day. It was the largest civil rights demonstration in American history to that point. King got to Cobo Hall and delivered the I Have a Dream speech 2 months before he did it in Washington. He walked down Woodward Avenue arm in arm with Walter Reuther and Reverend Franklin, and the speech at Cobo Hall was recorded by Berry Gordy of Motown. All of the characters of my book sort of coming together in that moment. Of course, it was Gordy wanted to release the LP on August 28th, 1963, it was sort of superseded, overwhelmed by what happened in Washington at the March on Washington. And the rally and the Detroit version of the speech were essentially lost to history. So it was very sort of rewarding for me to resurrect it in all of its Detroit's glory at that moment. The end of the book, I wasn't sure whether it ended at the end of 1963 until two events sort of hit me. One was the release of the Mustang after sort of years of keeping it under wraps. The story of the building, the sort of idea of the Mustang has been told before. I wanted to find a different way of dealing with it. And so I really was interested in the marketing campaign. It was the largest automobile marketing campaign in history, conducted by J. Walter Thompson. And for that, my wife and I went down to Duke University, which has the largest advertising and marketing archive in the world, including all of the papers of J. Walter Thompson. And we discovered sort of the internal way that was done. They had a set of private offices downtown Detroit in the Buell building called the Tombs, and they worked on it week after week, how to sell this new car that would sort of represent the coming of the baby boom generation and of two-car families. All of that was happening right around then in 1963 and 4. And the original idea was to call it the Torino. And the original motto of it was going to be imported from Detroit, which is the very motto of that Chrysler commercial that suckered me into writing this book 50 years later. The idea was that it was sort of a made in Detroit, but it was this sexy European-looking car, which was fine until it was realized that Henry Ford II, the Deuce, another major character in my book, whose motto was never complain, never explain, was having an affair with an Italian jet setter at that very moment and separating from his wife, and it might not be so great to have a car called the Torino come out while this was all happening. The Mustang was unveiled in April of 1964 at the New York World's Fair. My dad, who was born and grew up in Coney Island, would take us back to New York every summer of my childhood from here in Madison. And I remember going to that World's Fair when I was 14. And my strongest memory is walking up to the Pepsi pavilion and ordering a Coke. Without thinking, it was unwitting. I wasn't trying to be a wise guy. But I also remember riding in the Ford Motor Wonder Rotunda, which was this Disney-designed pavilion in a Mustang. The first Mustangs were there. They were reconfitted to be on a track. And that week is when the Mustang came out. It was a little too narrow for me to end the book there, but I discovered that a month later, well, I didn't discover, but I realized that was how to end it. A month later, Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson, came to Detroit. He was supposed to come to Detroit in October of 1962 for the Detroit Auto Show, but that day the Cuban Missile Crisis broke out, and so it didn't quite happen. So he comes back on May 22nd, 1964, to give the commencement address at the University of Michigan. He wasn't originally invited. It was supposed to be President Kennedy. But of course, Kennedy had been killed in November of 63, so they extended the invitation to Johnson, and he took it. Kennedy had a very strong connection to Michigan. It was at the University of Michigan where he had sort of given his first call for the Peace Corps during that 1960 campaign. And of course, the University of Michigan and the University of Wisconsin are the two great institutions that provided so many of the young people who went into the Peace Corps after that call. It was also traditional that Democratic candidate for president would begin his fall campaign in Detroit, in Cadillac Square, with Walter Reuther of the United Auto Workers at his side. And that's exactly what Kennedy had done in 1960, with, by the way, that High Hopes being stolen by the Kennedy campaign as sort of their theme song. That's what I was thinking of when I saw that. Frank Sinatra singing it. And so Kennedy did come to Cadillac Square in 1960, and it was there that he uttered the first variation of the most famous phrase of his life, "Ask not what your country can do for you." It wasn't quite as poetic. They didn't put the "ask not" at the beginning, but it was the same phrase in Detroit. So it's kind of amazing to think that what most scholars consider the greatest speech of the 20th century, Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream," and the most famous phrase in presidential inauguration history, "Ask not," were said in Detroit first. So LBJ came to Detroit instead of Kennedy in May of 1964. He landed at Detroit Metropolitan Airport. He was greeted by Walter Reuther and Henry Ford II, the two sides of the auto industry. Henry Ford II, a lifelong Republican, endorsed Johnson right there. Johnson declared Detroit the herald of hope for America, the engine of the economy. And then he got on a helicopter and went to the University of Michigan and delivered the Great Society Address. And that's where the book ends. The characters in the book don't know what's coming, but we all do, of course. When I started researching the book 4 years ago, Linda and I would stay at a little bed and breakfast called the Inn on Ferry Street, and it was near the Detroit Institute of Arts. It was 2 blocks from the Walter Reuther Library, which has the greatest labor archive in the world. And I say somewhat jokingly that I felt walking across Woodward Avenue to get from the bed and breakfast to the Reuther Library, I could stop in the middle of the street and read War and Peace and not get hit by a car. So it seemed that desolate. And every time I've gone back since then, which is now 12 times, both for the research phases and since the book came out 3 times on the book tour, I've found more and more energy. And this last 2 visits were quite remarkable in terms of the vitality that you feel in Detroit now. Not just in the downtown, where a few very rich people and institutions like Quicken Loans and Dan Gilbert and Citibank and some others are betting their money. Of course, they want to make more money, but they're betting on the downtown coming back, and it is. And also that Midtown area where we would stay near the Art Institute is being flooded by young people. I tell college graduates, don't go to Brooklyn, go to Detroit. And they are. And so there's a momentum building there of techies and foodies and musicians and artists. It's cheap housing. There's a sort of a communal feeling going on in that part of the city, and it's incredibly vibrant. But there's still vast swaths of Detroit that are desolate. The day my book came out, I went to Detroit and met Kai Risdall of NPR's Marketplace. He wanted to do a piece. And he said, "David, let's go out to the flat where you lived when you were 6 years old." So we drove out there, and it was gone. It had just been torn down. It was rubble. There was, that sort of police type tape around the rubble. And 5 out of the 8 houses on that block were gone. And so what I say about Detroit is that, yes, there's a renaissance going on, but you can't leave people behind. There have been false starts before because of that. The true revival of Detroit will only come when you tackle those most difficult problems, which are to try to figure out ways to bring everybody along. The most important word in the title of my book, Once in a Great City, is in. It's not once a great city. It's not once upon a great city. It's once in a great city, because Detroit still is and can be a great city. Thank you very much.